Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's call on Philanthropy's response to the Ukrainian humanitarian crisis. Before we get started, here are a few call reminders. For any technical issues, please submit a message through the chat at the bottom of your screen or email us at webinars@cof.org. For closed captioning, please click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitle or View Full Transcript. This webinar will be recorded. The recording will be shared with all participants and posted on our website as resource. Finally, if you have any comments, please use the chat feature, or if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be monitored throughout the webinar and answered during the Q&A section. And with that, I will hand it over to Kathleen Enright, President and CEO of the Council on Foundations. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Daniela, and welcome everyone. Again, I'm Kathleen Enright, President of the Council on Foundations, and we're here to talk about this humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and the neighboring countries that has emerged since the Russian military invaded Ukraine last week. Nearly 1 million Ukrainians and other people living peacefully in that country have fled to neighboring countries to avoid the violence, and the toll on human life and the suffering just continues to accumulate day by day. This is really hard to watch, and I know that it is harder for some than it is for others, because many of us, even here in this room and on this call, have loved ones in the region, in Ukraine, and in the neighboring countries, and even in Russia, folks who are suffering there too. So you may be scrambling to be in touch with those folks. You may be worried. You might be scrambling to evacuate your regional staff. You might be providing emergency support to the nonprofits that you work with, your other civil society partners in the region. I just want to say our hearts are with you, with your loved ones, with all Ukrainians at home and across the globe. So that is where we start this conversation. And we're here because philanthropy has a critical role to play. Philanthropy is always responsive in times of crisis. We're here providing humanitarian support whenever there is need, but doing so during an armed conflict brings inordinate challenges. And that is why we are so pleased today to be joined by two State Department officials who have deep expertise and who are here to share what they know and what they are able to share about the situation on the ground in this unfolding crisis. So our State Department partners are both here to listen and to share because they recognize the important partnership that philanthropy brings, both in the emerging and urgent humanitarian aid and relief efforts, but also over the long term, how philanthropy can marshal that long-term, broad-scale, strategic support and investments that are so necessary to strengthen democracy, to build back and to push back against authoritarianism. So I want to thank them for being here, and I will introduce them in just 1 minute. And I also want to thank the various council members who are already responding to the crisis and who've been investing for a long time in building democracy in that region. That includes the 3 philanthropy speakers who are on this call, who I will introduce in just a second, as well as many others who have built relief funds who are linked on our website. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers, who I'm so pleased to be joined with today. So our State Department colleagues are Tomas Debass, and he is the Managing Director of the Office of Global Partnership. And Tomas has been a longtime partner of the Council and many others in philanthropy. He's responsible for coordinating the department's engagement with the private sector. So Tomas, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kathleen.
Of course. And then also with us is Molly Montgomery. Molly is the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. She is having, an incredibly busy week and is deeply engaged in trying to be responsive. She is responsible for relationships with Western Europe and the European Union. And I've now learned that she previously worked in Ukraine, so she has deep connections there too. So Molly, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Of course.
Thank you, Kathleen. We appreciate it. I want to obviously acknowledge Kathleen and her team and the Council on Foundations on your prompt response to us when we asked you to convene this meeting. We appreciate that you were able to put an amazing, set of organizations that are joining us today. And it's unfortunate, obviously, that we're convening under these circumstances, and therefore, given the seriousness of and the urgency of this crisis, I want to kind of go to the point. As President Biden alluded to on Tuesday night during the State of the Union address, we are committed to ensuring that those affected by the criminalist aggression in Ukraine will receive the support they need and deserve. Our goal is to reach all of those who have been adversely affected by this crisis, whether they are citizens of Ukraine or immigrants who moved to the country for a better life or a better chance at life. We are closely coordinating with international partners to monitor the situation in Ukraine, and will continue to work with them to address the humanitarian needs in Ukraine and in the region. We are issuing a call to action to all of you in the philanthropic world to join us in addressing this unfolding humanitarian crisis. We are partnering with the likes of GoFundMe.org, as we did in the crisis in Afghanistan, on this creating a Ukraine coalition to match charitable giving to where the needs are the greatest. I invite you, your foundations, your organizations to join us in this effort by visiting GoFundMe.com/F/Ukraine Coalition. I'll let my colleagues give you the link, or emailing uc@gofundme.org. My colleagues will post it again on the chat box. Additionally, I'd like to highlight GoFundMe.org crowdfunding campaign they did with the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund that is designed to mobilize the wider public, the American people and organizations and companies to contribute to this relief effort. So on that note, also I want to also highlight USAID. Our colleagues at USAID have a website, the Center for International Disaster Information, which also provides information how the American people, American organizations can support the relief effort in Ukraine. And also I'll let my colleagues give you that website. While these are three different examples that I'm just giving you on how you can work with us and with the nonprofit sector to mitigate the crisis in Ukraine, our response will continue to be based on the assessment of the growing needs and relief efforts on the ground in the coordination with the government of Ukraine, the United Nations, and other humanitarian organizations and donors. The U.S. Department of State will continue to recommend and work with the GoFundMe and other organizations and letting them know the most effective way to deliver needs-based assistance with impartiality, humanity, neutrality, and independence. If you would like to partner with us on, or you know of organizations that are working tirelessly on the ground that need support, please email us at partnerships@state.gov, and my team will work diligently to make sure that these questions and these needs are being met. So you're actually here not to listen to me. I'm just the guy who brings partnerships together, but it is my own colleague, Debass, Molly Montgomery, who is, as Kathleen introduced her, who is right now, I do not envy her job. She's got probably one of the toughest jobs at the department, who's dealing with this crisis. So I will pass the mic to Molly, who will give you the context of this crisis and also how you could be best engaged. Molly, the mic is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Tomas. And I will be brief because I know you all have questions that we really do want to answer, and we also want to hear from you. But I won't spend a lot of time going over the situation on the ground. I think all of us have been glued to our TVs over the last 10 days or so. I will just say that even as someone who spent the last few months working urgently on the effort to have diplomacy and dialogue with Russia to prevent this war of choice, and to make it clear that we were ready to impose severe consequences on the Russian economy if Russia went down this road. We find ourselves in a place where not only is it the worst case scenario, but it's worse than we we imagined. And I can just say that, you know, as we're seeing play out hour by hour, that it will only get worse. And we obviously are seeing that the refugee flows are increasing exponentially. Over 1 million people have now fled to neighboring countries, Poland, Romania, Moldova, and on and on. And so obviously the need is incredibly acute. And we're just really grateful to have partners in the philanthropic community, and also really the outpouring of support, as Tomas said, that we have seen from the wider public. And Ukraine needs all of that support. The people of Ukraine need that support. They're really fighting for their survival. And so in addition to the links, sorry, I get emotional having spent a lot of time there. In addition to the links that Tomas provided, I also just want to say that the Ukrainian government is also urgently in need of support. And so we'll put a link in the chat for a fund that they have created. You can contribute directly, individuals as well as organizations, to support their efforts to vanquish their would-be conquerors. And so I'm happy to answer any questions you all have, but I just want to underscore the urgency of this and the fact that this is really the largest country in Europe, the largest democracy in Europe, fighting for its survival. And I think we've seen from the public response that that touches a nerve in all of us. And so I hope that we'll see a response accordingly. Thank you.
Molly, thank you so much. Gosh, there's so much to dig into there. And clearly we see both your commitment and you're clearly working so hard to make a difference here. I just wonder what, how do you recommend we as philanthropy balance the urgency with the long-term support that that the region's really going to need? Do you have some suggestions on that?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think what we would say right now is that it's obviously too soon to know exactly what the long-term needs will be. This is a really dynamic situation. Clearly, there will be long-term needs in terms of those who have been displaced. But for now, we are really focused on the immediate day-to-day of ensuring that those who flee are able to find safety, first of all, and to have their immediate needs met, and to support those who remain in Ukraine. And that's becoming more and more difficult because of the security situation, to provide humanitarian assistance to those who have been displaced, or just because of the security situation. Obviously, that has had a tremendous impact on just the ability for people to have their basic needs met. So we will be focusing on trying to do everything we can with USAID, with other partners within the U.S. government, but also international organizations and partners like you to provide for the needs of those in Ukraine to the extent we can, but especially as well to work with the countries that are the hosts of these refugees, and who I will say have really stepped up to welcome these refugees and to provide for them. And not just the countries that are on the border, but we have seen that from Germany to many other places in Europe, that there is really a desire to welcome these refugees and provide for them. And so I think as we see where those flows end up, because in many cases, these individuals are going to countries in the European Union, that will help to determine some of the long-term needs. But certainly we look forward to partnering with you as we are in this immediate phase, but as well as we look to the future.
I mean, we see news reports of private citizens stepping up to support refugees as they enter their own countries. Do you have examples of how European private business and philanthropy have already stepped in? And are there lessons that we as US philanthropy and the corporate sector can learn from that?
It's a great question. And I'll be honest, I think in terms of the corporate side at the moment, many companies are really dealing with the challenges of figuring out how this crisis affects their operations, whether it's in Ukraine itself or certainly in Russia in response to the really crippling sanctions that we have levied. And I want to just acknowledge what you said earlier in terms of, as well, really the people of Russia, and particularly those who don't support the regime and who are protesting this war, and the vulnerability they face, and the continuing crackdown that we're seeing in terms of closing down independent media, et cetera. And so I suspect there will be needs there as well. But certainly, while we are working mainly, I would say, with European governments at the moment, I think we will see, we've seen local examples of companies providing supplies to meet the immediate needs of refugees, certainly, and can work with you to get additional information on other cases as well.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I just know anecdotally in talking to some of our members that are corporate donors, their priority 1 was getting their people out. Priority 2 was starting to get some aid in. So it was, we're only in day 8 or so of this crisis. Well, thank you. And please, we're anxious to field more questions, both from the panelists and also from the audience. But I'd like to turn now to the panelists that have so much deep expertise as well in the region. So I'm happy to introduce the 3 funders who are with us today. And just, I guess, in alphabetical order, we have Nick Dijakuski, which I do know how to say your name, Nick. Nick has been a long-time friend of the council, and he is the senior program officer at the Mott Foundation. He has deep roots in the region, not just in his professional life, but in his personal life. Nick is Ukrainian by heritage and also by marriage. So this is a very personal situation for Nick. And he has also previously worked in the region in the Mott Foundation's Prague office with a portfolio that included grant making in Ukraine. So Nick brings a lot of personal and professional knowledge to this conversation. Nick, thank you for being here.
Would you like me to speak now, or are you introducing
I was just letting you get your voice in the room. I'll introduce all 3 folks, and then I'll go to you first, Nick.
Okay, thank you so much. Kathleen, indeed, my career working in philanthropy started in Ukraine when I became the deputy director of the International Renaissance Foundation in 1992, which, of course, Gregory from Open Society will recognize. That is the Soros Foundation in Ukraine. And I lived in Kiev for 9 years, so it's a surreal, just surreal that the city, the streets you walk on, and that it's being bombed. So I would want to say that the outpouring of solidarity from the world, and including philanthropy, has been tremendous and overwhelming. And I struggle to kind of feel like, how can I even be grateful enough for all that? But I also recognize that I think people know that this is a global struggle indeed. Yes, today it's about the people of Ukraine, but it is a struggle against authoritarianism, against the rule of bigger army versus the rule of law, and even a protection, I think somebody mentioned, of identity, because actually Russia is simply trying to rob Ukrainians of their identity. Back to the philanthropic response, it's happening at all levels. I was talking to my second cousins in Ivano-Frankivsk, a city in Western Ukraine today, that they're saying people are just whatever they can, they're bringing because I mean, this is a city, by the way, that it only suffered a few aerial attacks on military things. So right now they don't have armies pushing in, or they're not under siege like some other places are, but they are doing what they can. They have many internally refugees that haven't left the country but are internally displaced, that are fleeing war and violence and bombs. And sadly enough, there are more and more reports of Russian soldiers shooting citizens in villages. So it's a very real struggle going on, and so there's an immediate, getting to this, the question of philanthropic response. There's an immediate which is hard to figure out because things are still being contested, right? But even so, we know that there are the people who have made it to safety, and that their needs are huge. 1 million refugees already. There's that immediate is actually not only outside of Ukraine but inside of Ukraine as well, right? And then later on, maybe I'll address this a little later, the need to look into the medium term and look into the long term. There's trauma that people have to overcome. My cousin was saying that she doesn't have children, but her friend does, and said, she asked me, when the siren came on and they scrambled to a shelter, and said, "Mom, are the soldiers going to come in and shoot us?" So those kinds of things will need to be dealt with as well as the simply physical survival and safety of people. There are so many organizations now that are raising money, that are delivering money, and it's all good. I know there's a bit of confusion of where should we. Thank you to the Council on Foundations. You have a list on your website. We know outfits of places like the Center for Disaster Philanthropy or Global Giving have developed some funds that they're raising, the GoFundMe that our colleagues from the State Department had mentioned. The European, who are closer to the action, they've developed some very good sources, and the Ariadne network of funds they're more oriented at human rights. They are also have an excellent resource list, which I've passed on, and I hope will I think get posted. Maybe I'll stop there. I'll be happy to answer further questions later on.
Nick, thank you so much for that. Thank you for the personal intel that you're getting from your family here too. Shalani, I'll turn it over to you next. This is Shalani Edens, who comes to us from one of those providers of local funds right there on the ground to organizations that are handling the evacuation. Shalani is the Deputy Executive Director for the Urgent Action Fund for Women's Human Rights. They're providing rapid response grants to human rights defenders. So if you're looking for someone to give to, we have one of those groups right here on the line. So Shalani, why don't you share with us what you're seeing?
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you to the Council of Foundations for inviting Urgent Action Fund to be part of this conversation. We are deeply honored to be able to offer some of the thoughts and what we're hearing from the organizations and the partners that we work with. We are a feminist fund, and we're a rapid response funder. So we, as a part of our DNA and what we do, provide emergency grants to feminist activists and organizations. And so we've been working in Ukraine and the surrounding regions for many, many years. We are working very closely with partners in Poland and Ukraine and Bulgaria to mobilize resources for local organizations and frontline activists in the regions. Some of the things that we've been hearing from many of the activists that we are supporting is the need for basic humanitarian needs like food, medical supplies, medication, urgent evacuation and relocation, access to safe and reliable alternate ways of communication. We are also supporting organizations in surrounding countries to beef up their shelter capacity so that they're able to support the refugees that come across the borders. I think it's important to also just recognize that there's also a media war and Russia propaganda that's happening, and that's really painting a false picture. So another opportunity for philanthropy is to be able to support local media outlets and journalists who are trying to speak out against the Russian propaganda. So I was really happy to hear Molly mention that in her remarks. You know, when we're thinking about war and conflict, we know as a feminist fund, and I'm sure many of you on this call can share this, that it is often the most marginalized and systematically oppressed people and communities that are disproportionately impacted by war and conflict. So we're thinking about women and girls and people living with disabilities and LGBTI communities who are most vulnerable to human rights abuses. There's a heightened risk for gender-based violence. And at the same time, many of these communities are often the same people who are on the front lines doing a lot of the work. So one of the strong organizations that we work with in Ukraine is the Ukrainian Women's Fund, and their executive director fled Kyiv with her family to the western part of Ukraine. And one of the things that she told us is there are so many volunteers that are coming, and many of these are local people who are volunteering and people like herself who are trying to survive in Ukraine and help their local community. We are also hearing reports of African students being turned away from the border, trans people being misgendered and forced to enlist in the military, Roma families and Afghani communities being discriminated against. And we know that there is no room for xenophobia, racism, or discrimination anywhere, but particularly not in a crisis response. So it's really important then as we're thinking about a humanitarian response, that we're also thinking about these marginalized communities that oftentimes get forgotten and put off to the side. Urgent Action Fund does have a donation page that will probably be put in the chat soon, otherwise I can do it, that you can donate to, and all of the funds go directly to communities on the ground. And we are also working with several women's funds organizations that have been doing some incredible mobilizing over the last few days to put out statements. And the final thing that I'll just say is I think it's really the collective responsibility of philanthropy in this moment to listen deeply to the people of Ukraine and the folks that are being directly impacted by this, and really be able to adjust our grant criteria and think flexibly and adaptably in a moment of crisis and urgency. And I'll stop there and happy to take more questions and comment more.
Shalani, thank you so much. I can't wait to dig in a little bit more on that, and particularly maybe to hear from our colleagues at State about whether and if and how the State Department is able to focus in on those folks who are marginalized and potentially discriminated against in their attempts to flee. So Gregory Maniatis is here with us from the Open Society Foundations. And Gregory, he's the director of the Office of the Vice President for Global Programs. And for those who don't know of Open Society Foundation's deep work in the region, the Open OSF has been there doing pro-democracy work in Ukraine and elsewhere since the 1990s. And in Ukraine, as Nick has already referenced, it's under the auspices of the International Renaissance Foundation based in Kyiv. So Gregory, please just share with us your incredibly deep insights, because OSF is one of the leading foundations in the world on this issue. And so I'm sure you bring much to bear. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Kathleen. Probably not as much as Nick, who was there almost at the creation back in 1990. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a privilege to be here, more than a pleasure given the circumstances. I'm really grateful to Tomas, to you, Kathleen, to Molly, who almost had me in tears too, just listening to her. This is, for us, deeply personal, as you implied, in the sense that we've been in Ukraine since 1990, very active in the surrounding region. We don't see this only as a threat to Ukraine, but also to the broader region, and frankly to democracy more generally. It's absolutely a humanitarian crisis, and it's a humanitarian tragedy, but it is equally a crisis for democracy. And I'll get back to that in a moment. We have staff in Ukraine through the International Renaissance Foundation. That is an independent foundation, but we have been working in that country for a very long time, supporting journalists, supporting minority groups, supporting human rights organizations, the whole fabric of civil society that helped stand up democracy in Ukraine. And it is just heartbreaking to see that physical and democratic infrastructure now at risk, in addition to the 1 million+ people who have fled. I don't want to take away from the humanitarian side of this at all. This is where the urgent need is. We have been funding as well into the country, but also in the surrounding region to small and larger organizations that are providing relief to those who are fleeing, including, as Shalini said, paying special attention to those who are fleeing who might not otherwise get treated as well as others. So that is definitely a priority of our work. But really the biggest priority for our work right now, echoing what Nick and Shalini said, is to think about this as a moment where our common values are at stake. We are deeply concerned about being able to preserve the civil society infrastructure in Ukraine, the journalists, the other activists, those who are going to be involved in the peaceful prosecution of this conflict, and who will be responsible for standing up democracy and the governing institutions of Ukraine again when this conflict is over, and it will be over, and they will be needed. And whether they stay in Ukraine or whether they are forced to flee, our goal is, in the first instance, to be able to support them right now, and not just in the short term, but over however long it takes for them to continue doing their work. So we are looking to continue to fund into Ukraine, to those civil society organizations and those activists who have worked so hard over 30 years to build that country. And also to continue to support those who have left the country, not just on a humanitarian level, but to be able to allow them to do the work that's needed in order to be able to get their country back. I don't think there can be any greater champions of democracy right now than the Ukrainian people. They have inspired us all over the course of the past week in particular. I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime the kind of unity that has projected across the world, across countries, across every sector, across partisan divides, faiths. It has been amazing, and it has been galvanized by those people in Ukraine. And so that is our first focus. Our second focus is to also support those groups who see this as a battle for democracy outside of Ukraine, in the surrounding regions, countries which are also potentially a threat from Russia. And then third instance, to address the humanitarian aspects of this for sure, but in the mid to long term. There is a moment right now in Europe where we're seeing tremendous hospitality and love and generosity from the European people towards Ukrainians. We think that that's sustainable, and would like to see that keep going through policy changes that we're, I think, seeing in Europe right now, but also building real infrastructure. So I'll close just by saying that tomorrow we will launch a major fund that will focus on democracy in Ukraine and globally in the context of this crisis. We are going to invite other funders to join us. We see this as much about gathering a community to defend democratic values and the rule of law and human rights as to provide immediate relief. This is such an important moment to create that kind of alliance. So you'll hear more from us. You'll hear more from us tomorrow. Thank you.
Gregory, thank you so much for that. Well, I'll start this conversation between all of us with you. You mentioned two things. You mentioned that this is a galvanizing moment, that for democracy, for defending democracy, and a call to action for your fellow funders. our colleague Alex Toma, did a similar call to action in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, basically saying now is the time to invest in peace and security and democracy building. And so you gave one way that your fellow funders can do this. You're building this democracy fund for Ukraine. But if you have inspired, if this group, if the moving remarks, if the people of Ukraine are inspiring more funders to support democracy funding, what would you suggest? How would you suggest that folks invest now for the future?
So that is that's the conversation that would like to be able to organize with our fellow funders and try to determine what the most powerful strategies are. I mean, the attack by Russia on Ukraine is an attack on a country, but it's an attack on democracy. I think we all see that. And it's an attempt to divide us. And how we stand together at this moment, again, across philanthropies, from philanthropies across to our allies in the private sector and government, this is a moment to push aside all of those different kinds of divides and come together, because otherwise we won't be able to do what we do unless we win this at this point. And so, I mean, I can answer your question in terms of, supporting journalists and supporting organizations and human rights organizations, but really it's less about the immediate commitment of funds as it is the long-term commitment to work together now and to co-create strategies that will take this moment in history on, which I believe is the most important moment of my lifetime when it comes to the values that we represent.
Well, and it was a 30-year, at least a 30-year stint that Open Society Foundations made in the region that seemed to pay dividends in terms of your work here. So,
well, Kathleen, I would just say one thing on that point, having also been deeply involved in Afghanistan and having lived through the evacuations. I mean, there it was a tragedy, full stop, and we were trying to mitigate human suffering. I think in this case, it's a tragedy, and we have a chance to really do something extraordinary on the positive side. It's hard to say that right now with so many people fleeing Ukraine and so much suffering and buildings being destroyed and people dying. But this is a chance for us to come together and see something positive come out of this. That was not the case in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I hear that. I very much hear that. Well, so let's focus. We were talking a little bit about the democracy piece of this crisis, and we can go back there. But Shalani pulled the thread about who is evacuating and how they are being treated, and what needs and supports are being put in place for those who are most marginalized. And I just wonder if, Molly, if you have any intel about those reports that we've been hearing about the mistreatment of some African and Arab students who were in Ukraine and their ability or lack thereof to get over borders, and what's happening there now, if there are additional supports that are being put in place.
Thank you. Well, I can say it's an issue that we are engaged on, certainly with both the Ukrainian government as well as host country governments. I will say that I think some of the reporting that we have gotten on the ground has been that, understandably, I would say the Ukrainians in particular are trying to allow women and children to depart first. And so I think in some cases that has proved complicating in terms of longer lines for others. But I would certainly say that in our assistance, everything that we are doing with IOM, with UNHCR, et cetera, this is also just equity is certainly a concern in all of the programming that we in USAID have on the Polish border and elsewhere. But I can say that certainly these are reports that we take very seriously, and we are engaging governments as we see them.
Great, thank you so much. Nick, you wanted to add something in on that or a different topic?
No, just a quick comment on that is that, and this goes back to, just saying my appreciation for Gregory and what Open Society Foundations can do. if anybody knows and can guide and help us on the needs for Ukraine, particularly moving forward, not only on democracy, but on human rights, they can, because they've been in that battle for so long. On this issue, I was emailing back and forth with the deputy director of the International Renaissance Foundation yesterday, and she pointed me to the fact that a coalition of Ukrainian human rights organizations had signed a statement to condemn this behavior and to urge the border guards in particular to cease. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs on his Twitter, there's a tweet of a hotline for any foreigners, a lot of students, particularly African and Indian ones, that they can call to try to get help. So I'm just glad to see that steps are being taken in that direction, because of course that is definitely unacceptable.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. And I just wanted to ask any of the panelists if they had questions that they wanted to ask of our State Department colleagues, before I turn to the additional questions that I have.
Sure, I'll ask a question real quickly. Molly or Tomas, you might not know the answer to this, but what is the state of planning with respect to the U.S. welcoming refugees from Ukraine? And then supporting them here to do some of the work that we were talking about as well, with respect to allowing them to do their journalism, their activism, what have you.
Well, thanks for the question. I would say that at this point, what we're seeing is that European countries really are stepping up to welcome these refugees. And we saw today the European Union actually take a really unprecedented step in order to allow all refugees who enter member states to stay for at minimum 2 years up to 3 years. And so our focus at the moment is really on ensuring that the refugees who do cross into, whether it's EU member states or countries like Moldova, that they have their basic needs met, and certainly security. And of course, we have our refugee program that the president has raised the numbers for that, in addition, of course, to the parole of tens of thousands of Afghans as well. But at this time, we foresee that we'll be going through our normal procedures related to refugees.
Any questions from Shalani or Nick? Yes.
Yeah, my question, Molly, Thomas, is are there efforts to kind of bolster the banking system in Ukraine, against hacking or other dilemmas? Because there are good organizations in Ukraine itself that one would hope that we can get resources to. I think somebody put one in the chat. Yednanya, which works with USAID and the European Commission, actually is has been a grantee of ours. They also manage a network of community foundations, which is always a favorite for the Mott foundations, because those are grassroots. They are local. They could get they address local needs on a very very responsive level. So, but I'm wondering, are we able to ensure that financial resources still can get to those organizations?
Thanks. It's a great question. And I think there are two elements. One is the cyber issue and just the security of the banking system. And I will say that we have, along with European partners, offered support to Ukraine to improve the resilience, its resilience against those cyber actors. On the sanctions piece, I would say there's certainly, our sanctions have not targeted Ukraine. And I think it is much easier at the moment to get a bank transfer into Ukraine than it is to Russia. There may be some secondary effects of our sanctions against Russian banks that have subsidiaries in Ukraine. And so, that is a possibility. But I would say, in general, our sanctions certainly weren't intended to impact the Ukrainian financial sector. And I'm not aware of, you may have more information because you're in touch with folks on the ground, so you may be hearing more. But at this time, we have not been hearing, I think, major issues with bank transfers, et cetera. I know a lot of people who've been contributing to that National Bank of Ukraine fund that I mentioned and haven't had any issues.
Well, just to follow on Nick's set of questions there about sanctions. I mean, our members are foundations with large corpuses, and of course they want to ensure that they are complying with the sanctions. So do you have any advice or key messages for them?
Absolutely. So I would say that in general, if you have operations in Russia or financial relationships, particularly via Russian banks, I think it's important to just take a look at the compliance requirements. Obviously, we're not looking to target these types of financial flows into Russia. But the Treasury Department has a number of guidance documents and frequently asked questions on its website, and we're happy to help direct folks to the experts there, the technical experts who really can provide answers on specific compliance questions. But certainly, we are seeing, in addition to the compliance issue, of course, we are seeing that there, of course, is a lot of dislocation in the Russian economy and just disruption in the financial sector at the moment. And so there are payment channels that are still open to Russia. It is more difficult than it was 10 days ago to get payments through internationally. But, our intent has been to keep channels open because we do understand that both from a trade perspective, as well as the important work that you all are doing, those of you who are active in Russia, although we know that's increasingly extraordinarily difficult, that we don't want to impede those financial flows. So happy to I'm not I work on these issues many hours a day, but I can't answer probably specific technical questions here, but we're happy to refer you to the right people to discuss those issues with.
Thank you so much. I'm going to switch subjects quickly because I noticed we had a lot of community foundation folks signed up, and Nick, Mott supports domestic and community foundations abroad. So I just wondered, Nick, if you had any thoughts or advice for US-based community foundations who are either intending to support Ukrainian communities in their region or trying to support direct relief in Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for the question. The first thing is that those that might have Ukrainian American communities in where they are might look to seeing what the efforts that they are doing in supporting and raising money and materials and supplies. There's a lot of that I know going on in Southeast Michigan, where I'm located. There's a organization called Razum for Ukraine. I'll put it in the chat before that people can look up on. We have a Ukrainian American Crisis Response Committee of Michigan that's here, but I think that might be in other communities. So particularly is that community foundations might check what's going on and leverage and work together with those organizations because they have good ties with ones going on in Ukraine. Other than that, I put in the chat an organization called Yednanya. That's the pronunciation. It means unite, but EDNANNIA. And they have a call out. I will forward it to you at the council, and maybe it'll be available later because it's in a Word document. But they have a fund set up that which would channel money through into community foundations as well as other civil society organizations in Ukraine. It's an organization that does a lot of capacity building. They're going to be working on issues of digital security. So it's also, and this is not just an immediate need, put it this way, response to immediate need, but also to a longer term need is to strengthen the capacity and the resilience of the organizations so that they'll be able to operate going into the future. So that fund, I think, is an important one that can get things onto the ground through community foundations and strengthen them at the same time.
Thanks for that, Nick. Shalani, I want to ask you just a question about what you hope the State Department will hear from this conversation, particularly in terms of the folks that your organization most serves.
Thank you for the question, Kathleen. I think that probably the most important thing is really for the State Department to hear the needs of those marginalized communities that I talked about in terms of LGBTIQ communities, because oftentimes I think their stories and what they're facing gets silenced. For example, we just gave a grant to an intersex organization to be able to buy hormonal medication for their members. We know that, cancer patients are not getting their medication. So if they're not getting it, then neither are trans folks that need medications. So I think it's important that the State Department hear that. And it sounds like that they are hearing that. So I'm very happy to know that. And I do think, some of what my colleagues have mentioned about, the longer term needs, that's a message, I think, both to philanthropy, but also to the State Department, is that the consequences of this crisis are going to be long-term. We are just seeing the very beginnings of it. And so we cannot look away when we think that it's over, because the consequences are long-term. So the investments, both in terms of resources and strategy and policy, must be long-term. And then I think the final thing that I will say that I did hear Nick mention is just that this is really a global struggle against authoritarianism and imperialism. So it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the surrounding regions and what we're fighting against.
Thank you for that. In 1 second, I'm going to give each of you a quick moment for a concluding remark. I have been integrating questions from the audience, though I was not making that explicit. So thank you to the audience for all of the great questions that you've been sharing. And one final one I wanted to sneak in was about how to help Ukraine with non-monetary support. Does anyone have, do any of the panelists have ideas for that? That was a question from the audience. Support that is not monetary.
Happy to jump in, but welcome others may have ideas. I know we have gotten a lot of offers that are really, really generous from folks for in-kind donations. I will just say that I think what we're hearing at the moment, and this is often the case in a crisis like this, is that of course, right now, financial contributions really are preferable. Partly because the outpouring of support has been so great. And so what we hear from those who are active on the borders is that their warehouses are full, which isn't to say there won't be a need for these in-kind contributions in the future, but just that the immediate need really is more on the financial side. But I also, I think there are, and I can't make any recommendations, but I know that there are also a lot of folks who are thinking about how can they donate time in ways that can be helpful, whether that is, language services, whether it is psychosocial services. And I really appreciated the mention of that, because I think that's going to be a huge, hugely important long-term need. But those opportunities exist and would have been really very heartened, and I'll just make this my concluding remark, to see so many examples that you all have posted of the work that so many organizations are doing around the world. And And so I would just say that, you know, I'm not actually a development or philanthropy person in my day job. I'm really focused on the policy. And so it's just tremendous to see this outpouring of support. And I think we speak for, you know, our Ukrainian colleagues that they're deeply, deeply grateful as well, and just so appreciative of all of the time and effort and particularly the financial contributions thus far and those that are to come, because I really do agree with what Shalini has said in terms of, you know, and others in terms of this being really a long-term effort, both for democracy and also for the people of Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Molly. Tomas, let me give you.
Thank you. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us today. It is, as you've heard from everybody, every dimension of the conversation has been around how do we all step up and be able to support Ukraine. So we need your voices, speak up. We need your networks. Please open up your networks for this. Obviously, also, we need you to step up with the resources that are needed, just Molly just talked about. And we're here as a partnership office to facilitate and create these tissues between the Department of State and the private sector to support this effort. And we've been giving you our contacts. We were able to put the GoFundMe.org partnership, but it's to create efficiency for us. Obviously, we're trying to go wholesale rather than retail because it gets overwhelming to work with. So we've been working with them to vet, working with our embassy and our folks on the ground, organizations that are doing all the good work. So all these collective effective resources could go directly to them. And they've been so kind in terms of eliminating their fees and things like that. So, and if there are any other ideas that we have not discussed in this conversation, please feel free to send it to us. We do not pretend to know everything, and we're so far from it actually, because of fluidity and the dynamic nature of this situation. We are here to listen to you, to listen to your voice on that, you know, from those perspectives. Also, if you have any leads for us, and we've been taking notes, such as what Gregory's talking about democracy, we'll reach out to our DRL, our democracy and labor rights folks, to see if there is a synergy between your work and what they're doing. And also the equity problems, the discrimination issues that you're discussing. We hear that, and as Molly already mentioned, the president already talked about it. That these are not the values that we share with the world. These are not the kind of things we want to see. These are the moments where our high ideals need to be manifesting themselves. And so far, we've heard nothing but amazing pour of love and compassion. And at the end of the day, for us, from an American perspective, is that it is not just what the US government could do, it's more importantly, actually, what the private sector, collective American people could do. That is the generosity of America, the diversity of America, the folks who have background in Ukraine, such as Nick, and for those of us who might not have that level of intimacy and connection to Ukraine, but we still stand with Ukraine. And so it is our common ground is what makes this issue even more important. So on that note, I want to thank you, Kathleen, for taking the time to do this for us. Well, hopefully this is not the last conversation, but the first, because this problem is not going to be over in a week. It's going to be here with us for a long time. So we hope to engage with you. Please consider us to be a partner, a window, a door for you in the department to hear your voice, whether it's complaints, whether it's ideas, whether any other things that you have, we stand for it. So on that note, thank you for everything.
Thank you so much, Tomas, for thinking of us in this partnership. And we will certainly continue this conversation with you and with our members. Let me just give the panelists each a very short word. Shalani, and then Gregory, and then Nick. I'll give Nick the last word.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'll just end by saying that we stand in strong solidarity for Ukrainian independence and condemn all forms of violence. And I'll just also note that I think we also need to think about people who have been impacted by war and conflict and how this situation is very triggering. So for our staff, for the communities that we work with, I just want to mention that as well. And thank you so much for having Urgent Action Fund as a part of this call.
Thank you for bringing your deep insight and voice to this. Gregory.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Tomas, Molly, and Shalini. Those were really moving words. We've been doing this in Ukraine for 30 years. We'll do it for another 30 years if we need to. We hope we will do it together with you. This is gonna take a long time, but I hope that we can all work together. Thank you.
Most important things do take a long time. Gregory, thank you for your work and for sticking to it. Nick, thank you for being here when I'm sure this is a very emotional time for you and your family.
Well, let me address a quick practical issue. I noticed that somebody was asking about ER and ED in the chat. Here's a time for we obviously want the resources to get on the ground, but this might be a time where good intermediaries will help. Or there was a question of what happens if, Russia fully occupies, then money will get caught and it'll be lost. Well, I think those intermediaries are positioned to dose out the money in relatively small chunks, which might be hard to do from far away because of that kind of risk as well. Shalini, I'm sorry, the chair of the Ukrainian Women's Fund is somebody who I hired when I was at the International Renaissance Foundation. I'm glad to hear she's in safety. And the Ukrainian Women's Fund is just a fantastic organization. So I'm so glad to hear you're working with them. And for everybody, besides the incredible outpouring of generosity of your resources, let's not forget advocacy. I will leave that for you to decide what kind of advocacy you do, but hopefully we'll raise our voices in that respect as well, and prayer, and include my brother-in-law who's in Kiev in the territorial defense unit in that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. Well, thank you to everyone who came and participated in this. The diligent council staff who helped prepare for this so quickly, I want to thank them. And also who will provide you with resources in follow-up. This is only a first conversation, as Tomas said. We will be serving you in the ways that you want in follow-up, so we will be having additional conversations as they make sense. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you for the action you will be taking in follow-up based on the inspiration you got from these folks here. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Kathleen,
everybody.
Council.
Take good care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.